Nothing to see. Athens was in crisis. They had lost the Sicilian campaign, which was an ill-advised attempt to gain more territory and win some gold. They had lost the Peloponnesian War, which had ground on for 24 years and had forced them to expend their treasury. And there was a lesser-known faction in all of, we call it Greece, but what they called it was Hellas. There was a faction in Hellas that was eager to take over the rest, and that was Macedon. Macedon, which is this large blue area to the north. They're always very good fighters. They were very effective on the battlefield. Their spearmen and pikemen were known to defeat almost any other troops on the field. Their cavalry, called companion cavalry, were some of the best that were in all of Europe. But they always had a little bit of an inferiority complex when it came to the rest of Greece, especially when it came to the Athenians. The Athenians were the nerds of ancient Greece. They were into the poetry. They created all of the drama that we know of. They were home to all of these philosophers and guys that nowadays would be wearing Coke bottle glasses, guys that we call Socrates and Plato and Aristotle. And Philip II of Macedon was very, very, very eager to put all of Hellas under his control. He had an ambition to rule it all, and the Macedonians were notorious for being fierce and notorious for being ruthless, especially when it came to succeeding their fathers, whom they generally killed. Philip II being no different from the rest. So who would stand in the way of the great Macedonian army and keep them from taking over all of Hellas? Who would rally all of these disparate city-states and bring them together under one Greek banner? You might think it would be your classical Greek hero like Achilles, someone who was so fantastic in battle that his legend lives on, lived through the Greek Dark Ages over 3,000 years ago, and today the legend says that he was descended from a god. But it did not come from a great warrior like Achilles. It came from this guy, Demosthenes. Now, Demosthenes had a wealthy father, but his father earned his own wealth. He started a sword factory after being a mere blacksmith and swordsmith. And he was very frail, very sickly, and not very imposing. He didn't fit that Greek Adonis complex model of physical fitness that you would always see at the gymnasia and that you would see at the Olympiads. But he had ambition. But he was a country bumpkin by Athenian standards. He lived out in the Attic fields where they were chided for not being too terribly intelligent, and he had a very thick country accent. Yes, the Greeks had country accents too. They had their own rednecks. So he was ambitious. He was ambitious to make himself heard. He was not popular in the schoolyards, but he had a friend by the name of Thucydides. Thucydides had been dead, but he had a volume of his history of the Peloponnesian War and had much of it memorized by heart. But he couldn't get these ideas in his head out, so because he had a terrible, debilitating stutter. So he would go to the seaside, as this painting depicts, and he would practice his diction and try to be heard over the sound of the waves and the wind. He would take rocks that had been polished and smoothed by the surf and place them in his mouth and practice reading Thucydides to build the muscles in his mouth that he thought were weak, that caused him to have this lazy Greek country drawl, which there was such a thing. And I couldn't find this method in the Competent Communicators Manual, but I'm sure if there had been Toastmasters in 350 BC, that this would have been right there. And it would have been encouraging good diction and speech, but the whole fun being required thing would not have been a factor. They were not very nice people in public. But when his father died, all of his creditors, all of his business partners saw his one heir and said, this guy is going to be a pushover. So they took approximately 13 of the 14 talents, which is a unit of measurement that they used for gold, 13 of the 14 talents of gold that he was supposed to inherit, and just absconded with it. But he, with his practiced diction, was able to fight in the courts and win it all back. And at the age of 24, he was able to become what's called a triarch. The Athenian navy was funded by citizens, and there was no public treasury that would man the ships, that would equip them. So it relied on, and was a status symbol for many rich Athenians, to have this status symbol, being able to lead, run, and fight in their own warship. But then Philip became more and more aggressive. And with his status as a triarch, he was able to get a voice in the Greek assembly. They were democratic to a fault almost. And they weren't willing to act. Navies cost a lot of money, and the Athenian navy had fallen by and large into disrepair. So he made a series of speeches that were so invective, so powerful, that today they are still known as the Philippics, because he denounced Philip so harshly. Every dictator is an enemy of freedom, an opponent of law. The Athenians were and all Greeks were very, very staunchly independent. And he cautioned them against being complacent. While the vessel is safe, whether it be a large or a small one, then is the time for sailor and helmsman, and everyone to turn to show his zeal and to take care that it is not capsized by anyone's malice or inadvertence. But when the seas have overwhelmed it, zeal is useless. The time to prepare isn't when the war begins, it's now, while we still have the opportunity before Philip becomes too strong for us. But it took a full 10 years for them to react. And Philip eventually conquered Athens and forced them to help in his invasion of Persia. But eventually he was assassinated, presumably by one of his relatives, no one knows for sure. And that son was Alexander, whom the Romans called Alexander the Great. The Greeks preferred to call him Alexander the Sacker of Cities. But in a very short time, he not only conquered all of Hellas, but all of Persia. And when Alexander died, he tried to, Demosthenes tried to rally them against the Macedonians, but by then their army was too weak and they had failed. So even though he lost, Demosthenes still lives on today through his speeches, through the Philippics that are quoted and were quoted extensively by our founding fathers and by democratic leaders ever since his speeches were put to paper. So though he may have lost the battle and the war, he still lives on in history and through us. Thank you.
Madam Toastmaster, fellow Toastmasters, guests, and especially John. Thank you so much for such edifying insight. That a thick accent shouldn't prevent a person from practicing public speaking. Thank you very much, John. John was giving his project number 8 speech about visual aids, and his objective were to select visual aids that are appropriate for his message and the audience, and to use these visual aids correctly with ease and confidence. And I'm sure nobody is going to argue with me that he has achieved both the goals perfectly. First of all, the speech was asking for some visual aids to help us to understand the setting, where all these events happen, to show us this person he was talking about. Talking about war without picture is very hard, so it was very appropriate to use visual aids. He also was using this visual aids certainly with ease and confidence, because all this transition, I never noticed how one picture was replaced by another. So all these transitions were very smooth. The main asset I believe John has as a speaker is his charisma and drive. And it certainly showed in this speech. It projected to the audience and drove us inside. I also wanted to mention that John has demonstrated how well he mastered all previous projects he was working on. He certainly was using a lot of voice variety. He was using body movement, even though he was careful enough not to screen, to make sure that we can see what's on the screen, so he wasn't moving too much. I especially like the way he used the words for this speech. I could, you know, the words John has chosen and the way he was putting them together was always like he was talking in Greek. It was really elegant, very well done. I very much like the words like inferiority of Athens or notorious to be fierce. It did project this Greek soul of this speech. I have several suggestions. First of all, I noticed that sometimes what you were talking about was a bit disconnected from what you were showing. Especially in the very beginning, you told us that you were going to talk about the time when Athens were in crisis. And I wanted to see it. And what I was looking on was a map. So I actually was trying to figure out where the Macedonia was, where the Athens are, instead of thinking about this crisis. You gave us a great quote, Philippic, but you also read it. So I think it's very important to give us a choice what to do, to listen to you and to watch you, and that's what we wanted to do, or to read what was on the screen. I think that talking to us would be much more important. Your next speech would be persuading with power, and I'm sure that you're ready for it. I'm looking to this speech. Congratulations.